Well, I was born in Kansas, in Wichita, Kansas, and of course, I went to school there, and I mean that was just my whole history. I moved to Michigan after I graduated from undergraduate school. I went to Wichita State University and got a degree in music ed. From there, I ended up teaching fourth grade in Pontiac, Michigan. In fact, it was in Pontiac where Bukeka was born, and so I taught school there for 6 years. Then the movement came along, and I was more interested in the movement than I was in teaching. So I ended up being an activist for a few years while I was teaching. Then from there, I went to work for the Michigan Civil Rights Commission, where I did that for several years before I decided to go back to graduate school. And I went to graduate school at Stanford and from there, I ended up teaching. My first job as a professor was at Wayne State University. I taught at Wayne State for well, after graduate school, after going to graduate school, as I said, I taught at Wayne State University for 14 years. Then I went to work at Central Michigan University, which is in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. I did that for, I don't know, excuse me, I I taught at Wayne State for 14 years, and then I went to work at Central Michigan University. So that was my professional career, so to speak. And from there, I was active as a sociologist. I was also active, and not just a professor, but I was active in what continued to be the movement. So that's really my earlier history, my career history. And I retired from Central Michigan University in 2006.
Thank you so much for that, sir. I appreciate that. Like I said before, in Africa, it is said that the elders are library, in that they have had experience. When they talk from their experience, they talk from wealth of knowledge that we should never by any means underestimate, because we have never lived in their world. So it is
Mm-hmm.
important that we continue to treasure them for the experiences that they have lived. So I'm going to take some time to understand you as you were growing up. Tell me, what kind of United States did you grow up in as an adolescent?
That's a great question. Let me tell you, as I said, I grew up in Kansas. And for people who don't know the United States, Kansas was not in the South, but all the United States practiced segregation in one way or another up until the 60s. And so I did that. So but Kansas was different because Kansas did not have rigid segregation, and and so it was sort of mixed. Like my grandmother lived in the South in Arkansas, and so I would go visit her every summer. So I got to see segregation firsthand in Arkansas, where it was really, it was just a different world. Kansas, on the other hand, was sort of mixed, sort of a mixed bag. It wasn't the South where they practiced rigid segregation, but on the other hand, the rules of racial discrimination was nationwide, and that included Kansas. So I did that. So growing up in Kansas, I experienced going to school that were not segregated schools. Well, let me correct that. The schools I went to were segregated from the kindergarten through the 8th grade. From the 9th grade on, they were not segregated. So I went to school with whites in junior high as well as in high school. And as a result of that, I was in a number of organizations that were not segregated. Like I was in the drum and bugle corps. I was also in the band and the orchestra. So many of my experiences were on a desegregated basis. So that was sort of it. And the fact that I went to school with whites was different than a lot of my fellow classmates black classmates in the neighborhood, because very few organizations in school were integrated. Really, I mean, blacks didn't participate in the organizations like band and orchestra and things like that. I was also in the drama club, so my experience was not one that was rigid, where there was rigid segregation. On the other hand, all over Kansas, including the high school, there was make no mistake about it that it was segregation. So when I graduated um, from high school, I went to Wichita State University, which was really, I mean, it was integrated. I mean, I was in the band, orchestra, so I participated in those organizations on a non-segregated basis. But Kansas was kind of strange because there were rules where people sort of knew that you were supposed to be segregated. On the other hand, there was no signs colored, etc., and this kind of thing. There was no rigid segregation as it had been more generally. So and after graduating from undergraduate school, that's when I started teaching in Pontiac, Michigan. And I did that for several years before I went to work for the Civil Rights Commission.
All right. Thank you so much for that, there, Robert. Now, you talk of segregation, and I can guarantee you that there are some people who do not understand what that means. So, you live in the period that you are referring to as segregation in the school and in the society.
Right,
What do you want that to mean for children that are listening to you now?
right. Well, the the reputation of South Africa when you talk about apartheid, that's sort of what living in America was like at that time. There were several institutions for blacks, institutions for whites, and that was it. So that's what I mean by segregation: is that there were restrictions. If you were black, there were restrictions on what you could do, and so there was no freedom, no integrated, no organizations that were not where there was not rigid separation between whites and blacks. That's sort of what I mean by segregation in that sense.
Mhm. All right. Now, during this period now, okay, we understand a lot about what has happened in South Africa, in the apartheid regime, and the rest of it. And of course, what happened in the United States in the period that you are referring to as segregation now. But for us as African diaspora, it is important that we understand how the people manage to organize themselves, because again, this is going to be repeated a number of times in other part of the West, whether you're looking at the United States or looking at UK or looking at France or looking at Canada. Even now, okay, things have changed, but there is still a semblance of that segregational situation in many parts of the West in relation to African diaspora. So for us, it is important that we understand how those who before us have organized themselves. So interested in how the people organize themselves in this period of segregation. And I believe I'm going to ask you something related to that. But please help me understand. In that period, the society of the United States haven't yet evolved to the point that they could see everybody to be equal. They have a kind of understanding of what it means to be a human being. But the European at this point haven't yet evolved enough to understand how to live with other people. So they believe that you should live in your square, I live in my square. But today, 2023, we believe that we are more civilized, so we can all live together, sort of in the same society. But now, I want you to help me understand. At that time, how did you organize yourself when the society have told you that you are different from the rest of the people?
Right. Well, it began in the most profound way in the schools. As I said earlier, uh, I went to I went to schools who were black schools uh, until I was in the ninth grade. In ninth grade, I went to school with whites.